Hi, I'm Silas from Integral Works. Welcome to the new episode of our series For Better or Worse, where we look at the upsides and the downsides of each stage of consciousness, so the new problems that arise and the problems that it solves from the previous stages. In this video, I want to talk about orange. Orange is also called the rational or the modern stage, and you're going to see why in a bit. It's the stage that comes after amber, and when you look at our models, you see that orange brings a whole bunch of new stuff to the table. The emergence of the orange stage is actually a good example to see how dramatically our world changes when a new stage of consciousness becomes dominant. So think of the Industrial Revolution, which was a product of this stage becoming stronger, and think of how much it changed every aspect of our lives. It changed everything about art, about religion, about law, about everything we even use. The first thing you take into your hands in the morning was probably made possible by the Industrial Revolution and thereby by the emergence of orange. And in order to get this in one video, I will have to simplify and concentrate on the core aspects of it. So I'm going to start with cognition. Orange cognition is called formal operational thought, and it comes after concrete operational thought, which means that it formalizes whatever it did before. So it adds a layer of abstraction to it, and you can imagine this as it starts to think about thinking. So before, concrete operational thought can still use thinking to solve a problem, but formal operational will think how it's best to think about this problem. Now, there are different kinds of ways to test for formal operational thinking, and one of the original experiments done by Piaget involved a scale that had to be balanced by the child using it. So it was a very rudimentary scale with some hooks on the lower side that the children could hang weights from, and depending on where they hang the weights, the lever effect would be stronger. So they had to find out where to hang which weights. Now, concrete operational thinking would actually just kind of try and miss until they find the right spot where to hang which weight. Whereas formal operational thinking, or children with formal operational thinking, would look at the balance and find out the law governing it, and then just applying that law to the object itself. So the huge difference here is, with formal operational thinking, you can think about different possibilities to get to the solution before you even have to try. So you see where I'm going with this. This kind of thinking enables you to design experiments. And that is a huge deal. Experiments are a huge deal when you want to find out things about the world. Before that, you were pretty much guessing and following whatever tradition or ideas were there before. Now, with experiments, you can find out about the laws of nature. So the natural sciences are an invention of orange. They're actually what the truth, or the process of finding truth on orange, looks like. That's natural science. Okay, so now you design experiments, you find out the laws of nature. How does that change your worldview? What is the worldview of orange? Well, it's called rational. And the reason for that is, just imagine somebody like Isaac Newton, who discovered the laws that govern the path of the planets. You start looking at the world in terms of planets, in terms of little objects that have forces on them, that have mass and that have a velocity and a direction. So everything just starts to look as objects being governed by laws. So the world is a rational world because you can find out and predict stuff actually by rationally looking at it. That's why the worldview in orange is called rational. So now that we know about the worldview, we can go on to the values, because from the worldview to the values, it's just a very little step. You start looking at, how can I make this world better? So when you look at the world rationally, you also have to look at people rationally. And when you do that, you see that the differences that you saw before between different ethnicities, different genders, different religions are actually not that big. So before you might be thinking my European whatever ethnic group is the best one. It's the chosen one, it's chosen by God, and my religion is also the only true one, and so on. Now you look at these ideas rationally and you start looking for evidence that these are true, and you will see that there is none. There is no race in humanity. So people just look a little bit different depending on where they're from, and they praise God in a little bit different way, also depending where they're from usually. And once you've realized that, you see that, okay, if we're all the same, we also deserve the same rights. So equal rights, equal opportunity, those are values from Orange, very important. So let's talk about the achievements of Orange and what good it brought into the world. The first one is actually just a small step from this new value of equality, and it's human rights. Orange invented human rights because it saw that each human being deserves these fundamental rights. Another one that is equally important is, of course, democracy. When Orange started becoming dominant, you see the first democracies popping up, and it's because it just makes rational sense that people should govern themselves. If we're all equal, there can't be a governing or ruling class. We have to govern ourselves. And one way to do that is to elect representatives. So, democracy. Now in that same corner you had a lot of changes that are simply amazing. So for example, you had the abolition of slavery, you had women's rights and women's suffrage, you had the end of colonization, and all of that comes from this belief that we're all equal. Now, let's talk about natural sciences, and that's a huge other field where just amazing stuff came when Orange started becoming the dominant force. So when you can do experiments and find out the laws of nature, you can also design and invent things that make life better for you. So the first one I want to mention is vaccines, because no other invention has saved more lives on this planet than vaccines. There's this one guy called Maurice Hilleman, and I think he's American. He designed around 40 different vaccines, and it's estimated that his inventions saved about 500 million lives. Just imagine, he's standing in his lab, he's designing experiments, and he's finding the right substances, and with that alone he could save more lives than anyone else before him. That's how powerful this new empiric method is. Now in that corner there's so much more to talk about, but I think you understand the principle. Everything that is invented by using the empiric method actually the credit goes to Orange, because it invented that method. It's the way it thinks. So our lives are so much easier today than they were before because of Orange. So another important fact is, actually on Orange, most of the wars stop. And there's this funny anecdote that no country with McDonald's in it ever attacked another country with McDonald's in it. I think there has been one exception to that rule, but the point is that McDonald's usually makes their business in countries that are stable, that have a stable economy, and that is usually the case in democracies. So democracies don't attack other democracies. Why? Because people choose their leaders, so the leaders act in favor of their people, and the people with Orange values don't want to attack other people with Orange values. That happens when you have amber values or red. But when you have Orange values, what you want to do is you want to have trade relations. You want to have a strong economy, and your neighbor should also have a strong economy, because that's beneficial for both of you. That makes far more sense than destroying their economy only then to have nobody to trade with. So no more wars on Orange. All right, now what about the individual? Well, I want to point out two important improvements that you get when you come to Orange, coming from Amber. The first one would be the new cognition, formal operational, and the rational worldview that comes out of that lets you understand the world in a whole new way. Suddenly you find out all these wonderful and fascinating things about the world. And I can very well remember in my life when my cognition shifted to formal operational and my worldview changed into a scientific one. And I don't know if it really was one moment. I remember one moment, but maybe my memory just squishes things together. But the memory is of me sitting in chemistry class in high school and hearing for the first time about the atomic model and the periodic table. And my mind just went boom. I can explain everything with this. This is so fundamental and so simple. That was so amazing. And I started to apply it wherever I could, and also reducing a whole lot of things to it. But that was one giant leap for me, and just a fascinating moment. So that's what I would call a huge improvement. The second one is actually the liberation that comes from that worldview, and actually when you apply it to yourself, so your self-identity. Because on Amber, you are very much identified with your role in your community or family or religion, whatever it is. And you have to abide by strict rules that apply to this specific role. That's how the world works on that stage. Now suddenly, you start questioning the rules and the roles, and you start looking for evidence if they are actually true or if they are just kind of made up and traditional, because then you can just decide if you want to follow them or not. Because now you have a new way to check for truth. So you don't have to you don't have to keep the same job your father and your grandfather had. You don't have to live in the same town or village that your family had lived for ages. That's boring. You can be anything you want. You can be an astronaut. You can be a surfing teacher in Hawaii, whatever you want. So there's a huge moment of liberation. Okay, I think it's time that we talk about the downsides of Orange. The new problems that Orange brought into the world, as usually, are more complex than the ones from Amber, the stage before it, and they are too complex for Orange to solve it. The first one is obvious. When you can design any machine you want, people tend to design stuff to kill each other. And the most horrible weapons and poisons and bombs were invented by Orange. So that in and of itself isn't that big of a problem, because you still have these Orange values that tell you that you are equal to the other person or to the other people or country. And so therefore you should not attack them. So you just have these weapons like in case. But when your engineers and your scientists have Orange cognition, that doesn't mean that they have Orange values. And it doesn't mean at all that your government or anyone that is deciding what to do with this weaponry has these Orange values. They might still have Amber values. And that is the worst combination that you can think of, because when you have values that tell you that you are the chosen people and you should be dominating the rest of the world, and now you have this weaponry that is able to destroy hundreds of thousands of lives by the push of a button, that's very, very bad. And I think we all remember the last time this happened on a big scale, which was at the turn of the last century in Europe, when the Nazis just had technology that should not have been in their hands. Because when you have Amber values, you shouldn't have inventions from Orange. Now, another one is, of course, environmental damage. And that is actually simply because Orange does not see systems. Orange thinking is linear and green thinking is systemic. So green sees these problems. Green looks at the world in terms of ecosystems, for example, and it sees damage to the ecosystem. Orange simply sees sort of a linear causation. And when I want to maximize my profit, because one of the important values of Orange is wealth, then I tend to focus only on my goal and don't look at the periphery. I don't even see it. And I don't see how, for example, this poisoned lake has anything to do with how I'm running my factory. So Orange made a lot of horrible mistakes that we're actually still cleaning up. And the biggest one is one that we're still not at all on top of, and that's global warming. So another problem on Orange is the marginalization of small groups, because they don't tend to be that important to Orange. Orange looks at the world and wants to see big truths or big concepts that hold up, and any sort of exception will usually be just that, an exception, and it's not that important. So let me give you a concrete example of this. When you have a society on orange with democracy, you have these public buildings that belong to everyone, okay? So that's orange. Now, all citizens should be able to go in there. But what about the guy in the wheelchair? He will go up to that building and say, well, there's a stair, I can't go in there. I have the same opportunity as everyone else, but that opportunity doesn't mean anything to me. It's not my opportunity, it's yours. That is a problem that orange usually ignores, and green makes a big deal of, and it's right to do so, because that's actually not really equal. Equality on orange is not really equal. Okay, so that was the collective. Now, what about the individual? What kind of new problems does the individual have to deal with on orange? I want to talk about one specifically because we encounter that the most, and that is the moment of disillusion when you have an orange worldview and you have to let go of a whole bunch of old truths and views. So before I talked about how liberating that can be, but at the same time, it can be very frightening, and it can lead to a sort of depression or nihilism, because just imagine that you always knew what was true. You always knew what was right. You always knew what you had to do. You always knew where your future would be. Now suddenly you find out that was just all made up in some way. That was all just what your parents taught you and what they thought was true because their parents taught it to them. So everything just falls apart. Suddenly there is truth in the scientific and material kind of way, but how can you follow that? How can you get value from that? How do you know what is right? How do you know who you are? Are you just a bunch of atoms in a pile that magically came to life? Nobody knows why and how, but now you're here and now you have to kind of decide what to do with yourself. That's a very bleak and dark way to look at what before was a wonder and was a God-given wonder of life. Now this can be something that is not only very frightening, but it can also, as I said, lead to depression. It can lead to burnout. It can lead to nihilism, or even to actively repressing or resisting this orange emergence in you, which then leads to mental illness. Now, I'm gonna give you one bonus problem that comes from orange, and it's a bonus problem because it will not be solved by green. It might be solved by the integral stages, and it's a problem that is a fundamental flaw in democracy. Now, I'm Swiss and I'm a big fan of democracy, and I think ours, which is a direct democracy, is one of the best on the planet. But there is still something very, very much wrong with it, and it's in the design of democracy itself. So in democracy, everybody gets a vote, and that does not make sense. How can it be that somebody who has no clue about an issue has the same amount to say about that issue as somebody who's an expert? And it's not even about knowledge only, it's also about values. How can it be that people who have lower values have the same vote that people who have higher values? It's crazy. So the result of this is just these weird kind of elections that we have, where just imagine you have to make a policy about the problems in the Middle East. You see this a lot in American elections, where the presidential candidates have to dumb down this stuff so much that the stupidest people understand it, and so you lose all of the nuances. Just because these people who don't understand shit have the same vote as somebody who is highly developed and highly educated. That doesn't make sense. Now, this problem will not be solved by green, because green is all about equality. It might be solved by the integral stages, because integral thinks about the world in terms of evolution or in terms of development, and it acts with developmental differences in mind. So it would make sense to design a sort of evolutionary democracy. That would be very important and extremely difficult to do, and I hope that we see some interesting ideas about this soon. Anyway, that was it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something about Orange. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them, and I'll see you in the next video about green.